Welcome back to the program. We're getting deep into the conversation. Although we kind of touched on it before the break, we're talking about sexual offences and the law. Do you understand how the law covers you in case of sexual offences, whether you are the accuser or the accused? And also, what progress has the country made in the fight against sexual offences? That's what we want to hear from you. 22422 is the SMS line. The hashtag is Daybreak. And we're looking at two cases in particular that have, captured the attention of the media over the last couple of weeks. One where a court awarded a journalist, Tony Mochama, 9 million shilling damages after it was found that he was defamed by two women who accused him of sexual harassment. But on the flip side, two Kenyan rugby players are currently awaiting sentencing after they were found guilty of rape. So we have lots to talk about in regards to this topic, and I think I'll start with Elvis on this particular matter. Elvis, let's start with the definition of consent, because that particular word is used in every rape case.
Yeah.
Yes. What's your definition of consent?
So it's actually the legal definition of consent.
Let's go with that. It's good to have a family lawyer here with us. Go ahead.
From various pieces of legislation, including the Age of Majority Act and such kinds of legislation, consent, for consent to be valid, it must be informed. It must be made by someone who is capable of giving consent. A minor, for instance, does not have the capacity to consent. So it has to be someone over the age of 18. It must be informed, and here information means knowledge of what is being consented about and its ramifications. So, and of course, situations where you have someone who is intoxicated or suffering from insanity, those are vitiating, they call them vitiating factors that amount to no consent in such situations. So the law defines consent. We do not exactly have a one-rounded definition of consent, but it pretty much says what consent is and is not.
And who can give consent.
And who can give consent.
Can give consent, yeah. And do they have full knowledge of what they are consenting
yes,
to?
And the circumstances under which consent can be given.
Is there a case, sorry for interrupting, where consent has been given but then withdrawn halfway through?
Yes.
And how do you, that was your question,
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Once consent has been given, the same capacity to give consent includes the capacity to withdraw that consent. Mm-hmm. And for instance, when you're talking about sexual activity, consent can be withdrawn at any point during that process. Yeah, and there was a case some time back where it involved a commercial sex worker who was a victim of sexual offences, and the complainant, the accused person, had been accused of rape, and his argument was, I paid for it and you consented. The law and the judge said consent can be withdrawn regardless of what has transpired before that consent has been given. And at the moment where it is withdrawn, everything that follows from that moment in sexual acts becomes illegal, becomes rape.
And Vivian, and that's where the main concern is, because usually at that particular point, it's just the two of you. How do you prove that consent was withdrawn? Because it ends up being my word against yours. So I say you consented, you say you withdrew it. So how do you prove it?
The question, just like my colleague has said, the question of consent is, was it acceptable to you? Was it, did this other person, the accused, do it intentionally and unlawful? You got that consent intentionally and you knew that it was unlawful and you were not intoxicated. So therefore, I know that is the issue that happens mostly during rape issues and especially sexual offences cases. When you go to court, you have to show that the consent was withdrawn and that you can say, I said no, I refused, I pushed him aside, I said no. And you can show that this person was trying and was forcing penetration in cases of rape, was forcing and was trying to acquire in terms of force the consent from me. So you need to show that I tried to push him away. If you said no and you probably were okay with it, then that's the challenge. But you need to show that I refused, I pushed him away, I said no, I was forceful, and he kept doing it, Now that becomes where the consent, now that is the line that is drawn by the law.
So then the evidence needs to be almost physical at some point.
And just to add to that, in such cases where there's a dispute, where there's one person's word against the other, most times it is resolved by using forensic evidence. because especially in sexual activity, where consent has been withdrawn, there would be biological factors, and maybe the doctor would mention about that, that would show that consent was withdrawn, either through presence of tear marks or some kind of struggle that happened at that point. So that forensic evidence is usually adduced in court to support the victim statement to say that I actually withdrew consent.
Okay. Go ahead.
I'm still seeing loopholes in that.
I totally,
No, go ahead. Maybe you might answer my question in the process.
Kind of like I'm trying to read your mind.
Yeah.
Consent is not static. Let's start from there. Consent is dynamic, meaning it's not time bound. I can start by saying yes, and then I'll change my mind and tell you no. As Wakili says, the multiple factors as a medical doctor will actually be able to see when I do a physical examination and even a mental state examination to a survivor. I really
Even if that examination is coming 4 months after
that is another thing I wanted to speak about.
Gap.
Allow me to say I repulse the world of victims, because it also carries a lot of stigma, weighty issues around stigma to the survivors. I prefer using the word survivors because it's a bit empathetic. So to the survivors,
we'll use the word survivors.
Thank you for acknowledging that. For the survivors, particularly within the first 24 hours, are very critical, because if you come to me as a clinician, I will do a comprehensive physical examination. If it's a sexual case like a rape, we have a PRC, a post-rape form, which we can actually feel it comprehensively. Then I would be able to use this, because if I am the one who's filled this, I'll go to court as an expertise in the court, and I'll give evidence against this. The other things, as Wakili says, is that within the, if it was anal, forced anal or forced vaginal, I'll actually find marks, and there are characteristic marks around lacerations, other tears, and there'll be bleeding at that particular point. There'll be spermatozoa, for instance, which will actually be also used as evidence within court. And that's a very important thing that we have to also remember, and that's actually another gap that exists, as you're saying, Trevor, that how many of us actually have the knowledge that when a violation like that occurs, you need to get care immediately. No showering, no changing clothes, no touch, nothing. That whole process. A lot of us, and this is where most of these cases are actually thrown out in court, a lot of us come much later. And what pushes people to come much later, 4 months later, 3 months later, is actually the PTSD.
And after a shower,
post-traumatic stress disorder. So you come to me as your doctor, I'll actually just document, particularly only if I do a mental state examination, but that's not evidence enough in court, according to the Evidence Act, for it to be admissible in court. So that becomes our challenge. So there's also that part. And then there's also the part around the survivors thinking, okay, if I go to the hospital, will they attend to me? There's also around the healthcare service delivery. One of our colleagues, Dr. Kizi Shako, she's a forensic doctor. One of the things that she found out is that there are also issues within healthcare services. If you come to me, I need to have the DNA kits. I need to have equipments to be able to preserve the evidence. Right. I don't. In fact, I'll just glab up and put them in a paper bag or something,
But can I also say this? You need to have the sensitivity to understand that this person has gone through a very traumatic experience.
That's the other thing around. So if you come and start
talking to them like any other patient, that will obviously
That's another thing which is very important around healthcare workers who are specialized to be able to handle these matters. It's not just anyone who can walk in and see a post-rape or post-violence survivor. No, it's someone who has the sensitivity, who has awareness has been created to them, and actually understands the process. The most important thing about that.
Even with the police.
Yeah. Even with the police.
Because a lot of this burden of proof is left to the victim, where else the people who should be supporting the victim, the police, the healthcare system, they're the duty bearers to make sure that this actually goes to court and it gets into a logical conclusion. But we have rape victims who go to court, and to police stations to report. And I'm telling you the things that because we take them as human rights defenders. We get calls and we take these people through the process. We take them to the hospital, they get the samples checked. When we get to the police station, the drama we have to go through. And you see that these police are not even trained on dealing with these
Give us scenarios. Is it that they don't want to take the matter up, or the way they're handling it is just so jua kali, for lack of a better word?
Jua kali can be it, but also our police don't even have the capacity. Let's first get there. So in a week, if they receive like 10, 15 cases, they'll probably just act on 2. because the victim has to do more than to get them to work on the cases. So you find that we have to go on social media and make noise and tag DPP and DCI and start making calls for them to act on these cases.
And this is time bound.
Yes.
Because if an incident happened now, you need to collect evidence soon
Yes.
enough.
And then also something else that I've realized of late, when we are getting victims, the people who are easily and readily available to take them in for testing is MSF. Nairobi Women's Hospital, we are having cases of women being turned away at Nairobi Women's Hospital. So now we are asked, our question as human rights defenders is, are you turning them away because the resources are not there, or are you overwhelmed,
and if they
or
sue
what
you
is
this
going
morning,
on?
you're able to prove that.
Yes, yes, we have
them by name.
Yes, we have victims who have come forward, and when they get to the hospital, they're turned away, and we have to now start figuring out where to take them. MSF takes them. That is happening.
Okay.
Maybe I mentioned something briefly around that. Is one of the things that we have to also take away is that why are we allowing non-state actors to take up a responsibility of our
For the state, yes.
It's not the responsibility of Nairobi Hospital, neither MSF, to actually provide these services. This
Usually
is
it's because the state may not be carrying out that function.
That's also then a governance issue that we need to actually start querying and auditing and asking, why don't we have the right mechanism and processes and facilities and human resource within government facilities to handle this? Because if you go with a P3 from Nairobi Hospital, it will not be admissible in court. You have to get it from government. Then if it means that then from government facilities that evidence is actually going to be credible, why not institute or develop mechanisms within government facilities to actually provide this? Integrate it in the normal services which are provided within healthcare service facilities.
Okay, very interesting points being raised. Vivian, I want to come back to you. And there's a question you asked before we took the break, which I want to pose back to you.
Yes.
Do we need a Me Too movement in Kenya? And and this is part of a global discussion, because what Me Too effectively meant was people now felt courageous enough to speak out.
Yes.
Speak out in the office.
Yes.
Speak out in their places of worship.
Yes.
Speak out in their families as well.
Yeah.
Do you feel that as a society we have gotten to a place where men and women feel relatively free to be able to speak out, or does more need to be done?
Women, yes. Men, no. Still, there is that they are hitting a wall, I may say, because the society is looking down upon them in the sense that, well, we expected this from Mama so-and-so.
So we expected this, to hear this from a woman.
Just not you. Okay? So as to whether we are making progress into the Me Too movement, and that is why probably Kenyans are feeling as if it is a woman issue. It is not a woman issue. Someone asked, I think it was through Twitter, that it feels as if the Sexual Offences Act is just basically on one gender. It is not Sexual Offences Women Act. It is just simply the Sexual Offences Act. So meaning it is open for both genders.
Yeah.
So no one is supposed to say that I never came out because I felt that probably I'm not. You need to feel courageous. You need to be heard. And probably, who knows, you could be the pioneer of the Me Too movement that is dealing with men.
But there's
You
also
never
the
know.
concern of how to sift through, because some of these accusations come several months later, and that is a controversy that has also dogged that movement, where people say this happened years back and it was not really sexual offense, it was just consensual, but it comes later on. So how do you sift through and realize that these are the genuine cases, these are the not genuine cases, and does a lack of conviction automatically mean false accusation? Because then the moment that happens, I can easily turn the gun and say I was defamed and now I want legal
I'm coming
redress.
for you.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
And that is why we have the courts of justice. And that is why it is upon the DPP or the prosecution to prove that within reasonable doubt, without reasonable doubt, that this is actually what happened. Without, I'm proving with the investigative report, I'm proving with every report to show that this is exactly what happened. And it's upon the defense for you to come and say, no, this is not what happened. So this again is for the courts. As to whether whatever the court is going to decide that is what happened, you have a chance to review, you have a chance to appeal if you're not satisfied with that. Whichever way, yes.
Okay.
That is not an automatic yes or no answer.
Elvis,
Yes.
you're a family lawyer, but as the sole male panelist on this program today, where is that gap for men that prevents them from speaking out on such issues? And it could be in two things. One, it could be that you've gone through an experience that you're afraid to speak about, or you know your cousin, your friend is sexually harassing someone and you're afraid to call them out. Where's that gap for men?
Well, for men, just as maybe it had been mentioned earlier on, is the socialization of a man is not to appear to be a survivor or a victim. Yeah, because there's a lot of stigma that comes out with men coming out to say that, yes, this is actually what happened to me, and I'm coming out to speak about it. So there's the society, I would say, the way it has
is men's biggest enemy.
Yes, not just even on issues of sexual violence, but also just on issues of violence, domestic violence in general. The stigma of coming out is sometimes worse than the actual violence that goes. So that is the biggest inhibitor. But I would say, like, we're trying to make strides in the country. Various organizations trying to, like Vunja Kimya Foundation, breaking the silence, trying to get people to speak out and, you know, provide safe avenues where a man can come out and say that this actually happened, because once somebody comes out, it gives another survivor the courage to also come out and say they also did.
All right, we have to take a quick break, but when we come back, I'd like to hear from all the panelists whether, and this is something Engineer Lazaro brought up on Twitter, whether it's easier to prove a case when the survivor is a lady as opposed to a man. Because you said that there are certain things you'll pick out for a lady, but what if it's reverse? Can you prove the same if a man comes and says this is what happened? Let's see what you're saying on Twitter, because the other question we also asked you is, Kenya making progress in the fight against sexual offences? Let's put up what you're saying on Twitter now. Kennedy Atinda says, first and foremost, we must understand what sexual assault, abuse and harassment are to help one know the right and immediate action and legal framework to undertake. I think the lawyers will define all those
three
sexual
terms:
assault, abuse and harassment.
They say they are ready.
They are ready for
Okay,
this.
we'll do that after the break. And one other one here at who? Oh, it's an SMS. Okay, 22422 is the SMS line. Emmanuel Musili, maybe in some parts of the country there is progress. I witnessed a case where doctors were bribed to give out false reports on a rape case just because the accused was from a more able family than the victim. Something needs to be done. So he feels that in certain counties, maybe the law is being enforced fully, but in others where money speaks, where money speaks, money does speak. And that's what determines how the case proceeds.
That's what we'd like to hear from you. 22422 is the SMS line, at Trevor Mbija, Citizen TV Kenya, at Waiga Mwaura, #Daybreak. Keep your views coming. We'll sample some of them. And if you have questions for our legal panelists and doctors, we'll post them right after this.